A former president lands in handcuffs. France issues a death threat warning. And one young captain now holds the trigger to either Africa's future or its collapse. Paul-Henri Damiba didn't return to Burkina Faso for forgiveness. He returned accused of treason, coup plots, and betrayal from exile. Togo just broke every unwritten rule by handing him over. Paris is furious. They're threatening sanctions, isolation, consequences. But here's what they're not telling you. If Ibrahim Traoré blinks, if he folds under pressure, the entire Sahel revolution dies with him. And if he doesn't, France loses its last grip on West Africa. This isn't about one trial. This is about who decides justice on African soil, them or us. And the clock is ticking. A former head of state, expelled in disgrace, lands back on home soil after months in exile. Not as a guest, not as a negotiator, as a prisoner. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the man who once ruled Burkina Faso in military fatigues and revolutionary rhetoric, has been extradited from Togo and now sits in custody in Ouagadougou. This is not a homecoming. This is a reckoning. And what happens to him in the coming weeks will not just decide his fate. It will decide whether a new generation of African leaders can hold their predecessors accountable without permission from Paris, whether the Sahel can define justice on its own terms, and whether sovereignty in Francophone West Africa is real or still conditional. Damiba is not just another ousted leader. He is a symbol of failure, ambition, and the consequences of playing with power in one of the world's most volatile regions. In January 2022, he led a military coup that toppled President Marc Christian Kabore, a man widely seen as incompetent and disconnected from the brutal realities of jihadist violence tearing through Burkina Faso. Damiba promised security. He promised discipline. He promised to restore order to a country hemorrhaging territory to armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The public, desperate for change, gave him the benefit of the doubt. International observers held their breath. France, ever watchful over its former colonies, stayed quiet but present. But Damiba's rule was a disaster. In the 9 months he held power, insecurity worsened. Civilians were massacred in waves. Entire towns were abandoned. The military, underfunded and demoralized, continued to lose ground. There was no strategic vision, no meaningful reform, just the continuation of a collapsing state under a different uniform. By September 2022, frustration within the ranks had reached a breaking point. A younger officer, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, led a second coup. This time, the rhetoric was sharper. The grievances were deeper, and the message was clear. The old guard, even the revolutionary old guard, had failed. Traoré accused Damiba of being too soft, too slow, and too close to foreign interests. Damiba was removed, and in what was framed as an act of political mercy, he was allowed to leave the country. He went to Togo, where President Faure Gnassingbé quietly welcomed him into exile. That mercy, it turns out, may have been a mistake, because Damiba did not fade into obscurity. According to Burkinabe authorities, he used his time in Lomé not to reflect or retire, but to plot. Intelligence reports began surfacing that he was meeting with financiers, disgruntled officers, and foreign intermediaries. The accusation is explicit. Damiba was orchestrating efforts to destabilize Traoré's government and engineer his return to power. Whether through a counter-coup, sabotage, or political subversion, the man who once promised to save Burkina Faso was now allegedly working to tear it apart from the outside. For Traoré, this was not just a security threat. It was a betrayal. And in a region where coups are currency and loyalty is fragile, it was intolerable. Burkina Faso demanded his return. Togo, after weeks of silence and behind-the-scenes diplomacy, made a decision that stunned the region. It extradited him. This is not normal. In West Africa, exiled leaders are typically granted asylum as a courtesy, a regional custom rooted in the understanding that today's victor could be tomorrow's exile. Gnassingbé himself came to power through irregular means. Togo has its own history of political violence and contested legitimacy. For Lomé to hand over a former head of state to face trial is unprecedented. It signals either extraordinary pressure from Ouagadougou, a breakdown in regional diplomatic norms, or a calculated move by Togo to align itself with the new Sahel order and distance itself from discredited figures. Damiba is now in Burkinabe custody. The charges against him have not been fully detailed in public, but the implications are severe. Treason, conspiracy, undermining state security. In a country still reeling from instability, where trust in leadership is paper-thin and the threat of violence is constant, these are not symbolic accusations. They carry weight. They carry consequences. And in the court of public opinion, Damiba has already been convicted. Street protests erupted in Ouagadougou when news of his extradition broke. Crowds celebrated. Banners called for justice. Young men and women, many of whom supported the January 2022 coup only to be disappointed, now see this moment as proof that accountability is possible, that those who betrayed the revolution will face the revolution's judgment. But not everyone is celebrating. In Paris, alarm bells are ringing. France has watched the Sahel slip from its orbit with barely concealed frustration. First Mali, where juntas expelled French troops and turned toward Russia. Then Burkina Faso, where Traore has adopted a similarly defiant posture, kicking out French soldiers, suspending cooperation agreements, and pursuing military partnerships with Moscow. Now Niger, where another coup has severed ties with the West and embraced sovereignty rhetoric that directly challenges decades of French influence. The pattern is unmistakable. A generation of leaders across the region is rejecting the old playbook. And France, for the first time in over half a century, is losing control of the narrative. Damiba's extradition is being framed in French diplomatic and media circles as a dangerous escalation. Officials in Paris have reportedly expressed concern that his trial could result in a death sentence, either judicial or extrajudicial. They warn that Burkina Faso's pursuit of justice risks setting a precedent that destabilizes the entire region, that it could lead to cycles of retribution, that it undermines reconciliation. These are the arguments being made publicly. But beneath the surface, the message is more direct. Do not touch him. Do not make an example of him. Do not show the region that African leaders can be held accountable by African courts without Western consent. France has options, and it is reportedly considering all of them. Economic sanctions, suspension of remaining aid programs, diplomatic isolation, pressure through regional bodies like ECOWAS, though that institution's credibility has been shattered by its inconsistent responses to coups and its perceived alignment with external powers. There are also quieter levers, banking restrictions, visa denials for Burkinabe officials, freezing of assets. The toolkit of leverage is well established. France has used it before. The question is whether it still works in a Sahel that no longer fears being cut off from Paris, because it has already begun building alternatives. Traore is not Cabaret. He is not Damiba. He came to power not through elite bargaining or international endorsement, but through a grassroots wave of anger at foreign interference and domestic failure. His legitimacy does not rest on French approval. It rests on his ability to deliver sovereignty, security, and a break from the past. If he caves to French pressure now, if he softens Damiba's prosecution or releases him under external duress, he will be seen as weak, compromised. Another leader who talks revolution but governs under someone else's terms. That perception could cost him everything. His base of support is young, militant, and deeply suspicious of anything that smells like neo-colonial negotiation. They want Damiba prosecuted. They want accountability. And they are watching. This is where the stakes become clear. Damiba's trial is not just about one man's actions. It is a test case for the entire region. Can a Sahelian government prosecute a former leader accused of treason without being punished by the international community? Can African states set the terms of justice within their own borders? Or is that authority still conditional on approval from capitals thousands of kilometers away? The answer will echo far beyond Ouagadougou. It will be heard in Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, In every capital where young officers and activists are questioning whether independence was ever truly won or just rented under terms they never agreed to. Regional reactions have been mixed, but telling. In Mali and Niger, both governed by military juntas aligned ideologically with Traore, there has been quiet support. These governments see Damiba's extradition as a victory for regional sovereignty and a warning to anyone who thinks exile abroad offers immunity from consequences at home. In contrast, more traditional Francophone governments in the region have remained silent or issued only tepid statements. They understand the precedent this sets. Today, it is Damiba. Tomorrow, it could be any of them. The old gentleman's agreement that protected ousted leaders is breaking down, and that makes everyone uncomfortable. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has said almost nothing. The bloc, once a pillar of regional diplomacy, has become paralyzed by internal contradictions. It suspended Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after their coups, but those suspensions have done nothing to weaken the juntas. Instead, the three countries formed their own alliance, the Alliance of Sahel States, and have begun coordinating on defense, trade, and foreign policy without ECOWAS involvement. The organization's silence on Damiba reflects its irrelevance. It no longer has the moral authority or the practical leverage to intervene in a case like this. It can issue statements. It can hold emergency summits. But it cannot change the calculus in Ouagadougou. The African Union has also been cautious. Officially, it opposes unconstitutional changes of government and advocates for dialogue and reconciliation. But the AU has learned painfully that blanket condemnations of coups do not work when those coups are popular and when the governments they replace were corrupt or ineffective. The AU's position on Damiba is likely to be procedural, call for due process, respect for human rights, and a fair trial. But it will not intervene to prevent his prosecution. It cannot afford to be seen as protecting someone accused of plotting against a sitting government, especially when that government enjoys significant domestic support. What France seems to misunderstand or refuse to accept is that this moment was inevitable. Decades of selective accountability, where African leaders were protected as long as they remained friendly to Paris, have created a credibility crisis. The rhetoric of sovereignty and independence has been hollowed out by the reality that Francophone Africa's political class has operated under unwritten rules dictated from abroad. When France supports a leader, that leader is safe. When France withdraws support, that leader falls. Traoré and leaders like him are rejecting that system entirely. They are not asking for France's permission to govern. They are not negotiating the terms of justice with external actors. They are asserting, through actions like this extradition, that Burkina Faso's courts will decide what happens to Burkina Faso's leaders. But asserting sovereignty is not the same as securing it. Traoré still faces immense challenges. Burkina Faso remains one of the most dangerous countries on earth. Jihadist groups control vast swaths of territory. Hundreds of thousands of people are internally displaced. The economy is fragile. Public services are collapsing in rural areas. The military, despite nationalist fervor, is still outgunned and under-resourced. Traoré has bet heavily on partnerships with Russia, but Russian support, while symbolically powerful, has not yet translated into the kind of comprehensive security assistance needed to turn the tide. If he cannot deliver results on the ground, the nationalist momentum that brought him to power will erode, and his handling of the Damiba case will be seen as a distraction or worse, a vendetta. There is also the question of what happens inside the courtroom. Trials of former heads of state are notoriously complex. They require evidence, witnesses, legal frameworks that can withstand scrutiny. Damiba will likely have access to lawyers, possibly foreign ones. If the trial is perceived as a sham, rushed, or politically motivated, it will hand ammunition to critics who argue that Traoré is consolidating power through repression rather than governance. Conversely, if Damiba is acquitted or receives a lenient sentence, Traoré's base will feel betrayed. The trial must be seen as legitimate, transparent, and fair, even as it delivers the accountability that the public demands. That is an extraordinarily difficult balance to strike. France's warnings of severe consequences if Damiba is harmed reveal a deeper anxiety. This is not really about one man's rights or the sanctity of due process. It is about control. France is watching its influence in the Sahel collapse in real time, and every assertion of independence by governments in the region is a reminder of that collapse. The extradition of Damiba, carried out by Togo under pressure from Burkina Faso, shows that even traditionally compliant states are recalculating their positions. If Togo, a country long seen as within France's sphere, is willing to make this move, what does that say about the durability of French influence elsewhere? This is where the broader implications come into focus. The Damiba case is a microcosm of the larger struggle over the future of the Sahel. On one side, a vision of governance rooted in historical relationships, international norms as defined by Western institutions, and incremental reform within existing frameworks. On the other, a vision rooted in radical sovereignty, rejection of external oversight, and accountability determined locally, even if the methods are imperfect. These are not abstract ideological positions. They are lived realities for millions of people in the region who are tired of watching their leaders answer to foreign capitals before their own citizens. What happens next could redefine the region. If Traore proceeds with the trial and Damiba is convicted, it will embolden other governments to pursue similar accountability measures. It will signal that the age of impunity for leaders who fail or betray their countries is ending, at least in the Sahel. It will also invite retaliation from France and its allies, retaliation that could take economic, diplomatic, or even covert forms. Burkina Faso will have to withstand that pressure, and whether it can depends not just on Traore's resolve, but on the strength of regional alliances, the depth of public support, and the availability of alternative partnerships. If Traore backs down, if Damiba is released or given a symbolic sentence under external pressure, the consequences will be internal and immediate. The credibility of the revolution will collapse. The narrative that Burkina Faso is charting its own path will be exposed as performative, and Traore himself will become vulnerable to the same kind of discontent that toppled his predecessors. In a region where legitimacy is fragile and coups are frequent, weakness is fatal. France's strategy of framing this as a humanitarian concern, of warning about death sentences and extrajudicial killings, is calculated. It allows Paris to position itself as the defender of human rights and the rule of law, even as it pressures a sovereign state to abandon a prosecution. But that framing is increasingly ineffective in a region where publics no longer see France as a neutral arbiter. They see it as a former colonial power trying to preserve influence through selective moralism. The warnings are not landing the way they used to. Damiba's return is also a moment of reflection for the region. How should failed leaders be treated? Is exile a sufficient consequence, or does it simply allow dangerous figures to regroup and plot? Should accountability be pursued even if it risks instability? Or should pragmatic reconciliation take precedence? These are not easy questions, and different countries will answer them differently. But the fact that they are being asked openly and without deference to external pressure represents a shift. The trial of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba will be watched across Africa and beyond. It will be analyzed for legal precedent, for political symbolism, for what it reveals about power in the 21st century Sahel. It will be used as evidence by both supporters and critics of the new wave of Sahelian governance. And it will be remembered as a turning point, one way or another. Either the moment when a young, defiant government proved it could hold a former leader accountable on its own terms, or the moment when external pressure once again determined the outcome of an African trial. Traore's choice is stark: uphold the demands of his people and risk the wrath of France, or bow to external pressure and lose the legitimacy that brought him to power. There is no middle ground that satisfies both. And in a region where every decision carries existential weight, where every misstep can trigger collapse, the consequences of this choice will extend far beyond Damiba's fate. They will shape the trajectory of Burkina Faso, the cohesion of the Sahel alliance, and the future of African sovereignty in a world that still struggles to accept it as genuine. The question is not just what happens to one man. The question is who gets to decide.